Hello team, this is Dr. Miranda. I'm here at the Atlanta airport waiting for my flight back to DC. I want to discuss something that's very important, one of the subjects that we had for our discussion this week. I apologize because this video will go above the 3-minute limit which Brightspace has, because I want us to have a deeper conversation about the issues of subsidies. I have been very heartened, very impressed at the high quality discussions that the group has been having around this subject. But I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are subsidies inherently wrong, inherently negative, inherently a way that allows certain groups to quote-unquote cheat? Or are subsidies in and of themselves not wrong, not bad? It is a legitimate tool of government authorities that can be used as the means to protect our home markets against encroachment from exports. Can it be used as, again, a legitimate tool for trade policy? Another question is, what has been the effect or the impact of subsidies, not only in the national economy, but also the global economy as a whole, as this course is really focused on global trade, globalism, free trade, and whatnot. Those are all good questions. I think it runs the gamut, right? Some have said, well, we have data that proves X. Well, we have data that proves the opposite. I think that if we let go of our suppositions, let go of our ways of thinking towards, and I mean ways that have been cemented, I think that we will come to an understanding that at the end of the day, the subject of subsidies depend on another's point of view. If I'm a farmer and I'm struggling, and subsidies is the way that's going to give me a leg up, that's going to protect me against cheaper imports, then yes, I will love subsidies. I'm getting something from the government. I am getting the means by which I can rise above certain challenges inherently in the economy, right? But then there's another point of view which says, no, subsidies are inherently wrong because they create a bloated bureaucracy, they create a codependency on the government as the means of intervention into the local economy, right? Some have cited, hey, take a look at the case from New Zealand. New Zealand, about more than 2 decades ago, they decided that they were going to basically ditch subsidies in the agricultural fields. The data proves that there was less products, less production, less agricultural innovation when it came to agriculture, when New Zealand was offering subsidies to their agricultural sector. Now, 2 decades afterwards, New Zealand has become a top exporter. Their agricultural sector is doing amazingly well. They went from making 30-odd agricultural-based products under subsidies, and now they have over 2,200 different products, including what they called chocolate cheese, among them antibody milk, really deep, innovative products that came from the necessity to not only survive in a new environment that encouraged this type of innovation. We see this saying often in business: you either sink or you swim. Although there were some interventions, some measures that really helped the displaced farmers in New Zealand at the time, when the subsidies were removed. However, it was what we would compare to be a cold turkey approach to this. But the issue is New Zealand is not the United States. New Zealand is not Europe. New Zealand is not a developing third world nation, so there is no way of equivalence. We're saying, well, it worked for New Zealand, it's going to work for everybody else. It doesn't work like that. The markets, particularly when it comes to trade, now we're talking about the agriculture sector, is very complex, right? We can simply say, well, let's try this here in the United States. It won't work. It will create somewhat of a chaotic situation, right? In Europe, they have their own subsidies. The European Union cannot afford to do something like this at the same time. Perhaps other nations will attempt this. Perhaps they will be successful, perhaps not. That's the nature of subsidies. Are subsidies then unfair? Does it provide an unfair competitive advantage? We've seen in the case of Boeing versus Airbus, or Airbus versus Boeing, depending on which point of view you were. They all went before the WTO, World Trade Organization, and the charge by the Europeans was, look, the American government subsidized Boeing through tax breaks and also very healthy government contracts, primarily in the aviation field and the defense industry. The Boeing took the Airbus to court saying, no, the European Union provided subsidies, unfair subsidies, to Airbus in terms of very lenient loans, which of course Airbus had to repay, but at a rate, at the type of financing that it's a walk in the park, it's a breeze. So they fought at the WTO for, I believe, over 12 years. And some said, well, Boeing won. Some said no, Airbus won. And it's still somewhat in litigation, even though there's been some ruling. But you know how these things are, right? Airbus wins, Boeing does an appeal. Boeing wins, Airbus does an appeal. It will never end. Are subsidies an unfair practice in the terms that it provides certain companies unfair competitive advantage over other companies, particularly smaller businesses, right? There's a case to be made there, okay? For example, the case of China. China, in reality, subsidizes most of their companies, and you say, well, but that's not real. But there's another way that we can circumvent this and even say it's subsidies. It devalues their currency. It keeps it lower artificially in order to provide, again, a competitive advantage for their products in the international market. Now we have to come to an agreement here that every nation has the right to look out after its own trade policy, after their own interests. China will look out after Chinese interests. America will look after its own interests. The European Union will look after its own interests. You say, well, but that's not fair. Well, but the reality is that despite all of these self-motivating interests, I think that's a healthy approach because every nation will do what it's right for its own. However, what we see happening today in global trade is that nations do not adopt a zero-sum game because they realize that in global trade, there is no such thing as a zero-sum game. There's no such thing as just one winner, right? And even now, there is an adjustment, a realignment in global trade taking place. For example, the United States have said, no, the situation with China, we cannot abide that. Okay, too much trade deficit, too much disadvantages, right? Again, we go back to subsidies. Do they provide the situation where they will give a competitive advantage? That is true. Okay, the reality is there are companies that receive subsidies from governments. Okay, and it is in a way a tool to allow their companies or their home markets to have a competitive advantage over other markets. However, there is a leveling effect, because if every other nation is doing such thing or such practices, it actually levels itself out, right? So anyways, I believe, honestly, that subsidies is only a tool in the nation's arsenal. And I want to say, and I want to use this bellicose language, arsenal, okay? Because when it comes to trade, these days, it's almost like a bellicose action. That's where a lot of the action is at. It's in trade, it's in money, it's goods moving between borders, right? I believe it is very legitimate for countries to use subsidies as the means of leveling the playing field in terms of providing their products a competitive advantage in the international field, knowing full well that other nations are doing the same, right? I believe that each nation should do whatever is best for its own citizenry, right? Now, let's pause here, because there are nations which are able to leverage this type of subsidy well. They have the financial means, they have the volume, they have the economy that can really absorb this type of cost to the taxpayer, right? They have the means. They're very well versed, very sophisticated in their approach to subsidies pertaining to global trade. Now, other countries are not so sophisticated. They either don't have the talent to implement such policies, or they're just looking for something on the long term, on the short term versus the long term. I think that if a nation is going to use subsidies, that it has to do so having the short term and the long term in view. Anyways, again, this is just my personal opinions when it comes to subsidies. Everyone is free to have their own. I appreciate again the discussions that we are having this week on our discussion board concerning the topic of subsidies. Now, I wish you the continued beautiful week, and hopefully my flight will be a good one headed home. Take care.